Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. This is a follow-up video to the last video we did about all the cards that have not yet been released into Duel Links that were already out by this point in the physical Rush game. So now we're going to take a look at the cards that came to Duel Links a lot earlier than they did in the physical version of the game. Now some of these cards have been brought forward because maybe they were a little bit underpowered at the time, maybe it just makes sense for them to come in, but with these skills and shaking up the release order, as well as not releasing some of the absolutely broken cards other than Dragius, of course, things like the Dark Revelation, that does mean that the meta has been mixed up quite a bit, which has made it quite fresh for us returning Rush players. So the first card we're going to take a look at is the earliest card that we're going to be talking about, and that is the Descendant of Titans. So this is pretty unassuming, a level 1 1000 attack fiend monster. The reason this card was brought forward was specifically to be used with its trap card, that being the King's Majesty. Now King's Majesty was released a lot earlier, but now we have access to Descendant of Titans. It's made it a little bit better, I suppose. There are other level 1 fiends that could have filled the spot, so I'm not really sure why we brought this card forward, but it's fine. This card was released in Destined Power Destruction, which was the 6th main set in Rush. So most of the cards we've got are from the first 4. This was from the 6th, so not that far in the future, basically right after Maximums had been released. The next card we're going to take a look at is a card that was also released during that same set, and that card is the Silent Assailant. So just a 1500 vanilla monster was released again in the 6th set, Destined Power Destruction. Now this set was quite an interesting one because this set specifically focused around Asana and her worm type monsters. She introduced a new Maximum, she had new boss monsters. This was basically the second Maximum set after what the first one introduced yugioh and Magnum Overlord. But this set also introduced Mirror Innovator, which is a very important card for machines, Jinzo, which is a very powerful legend card, and the Music Princess archetype, which was the first time the Wind Warriors came to the game. Speaking of Music Princesses, Music Princess's Recital is the next card released in the set following this, Dynamic Eternal Live, the 7th set. This set wasn't anything too special. It specifically had cards in it to support the plant archetype. This was kind of the first big push for plants to be their own thing. They got new boss monsters, they got some new spell traps, as well as more winged beast support with the release of Night Vision. The next card released was the Dark Ruler Battle Slash. Now this card was released in Fierce Thunderstorm, which was the 9th main set in Rush. This set didn't really have much to do with the Gakuto style cards. It didn't really have anything to do with the Warriors. In fact, the only other card I can think of that was in there was another Winged Beast boss monster of Gakuto's, and his Winged Beast monsters have always been a little bit shaky just because they don't really fit in with the Warriors that well. They fit like aesthetically, but from a gameplay standpoint, they've always felt a little bit off. The next two cards that we want to talk about are both Guitarist and the Dream Drummer, because both of these cards came out at the same time, and this was actually during a structure deck release. That's because when Rush does their decks, they either do kind of a starter deck pair, or what they like to do is release the Strongest Battle decks, which is a series of main characters all having their own decks, and Roman's deck did contain both of these cards. But this was quite late. This was released between sets 9 and 10, and these cards were already going into a quite robust pool of psychic cards. Obviously, Esperard was already a card. At this point, we did have 3 copies of Roman pick already, so these cards didn't do a ton for the deck when they came out, and I think that's why they were brought out early, because these cards never really saw a ton of play. Guitarist is a fine boss monster being able to boost its attack, but it's already quite tight to find room in that deck, especially when fusions start coming out in the near future. Funnily enough, there were only actually 5 new cards in the Strongest Battle deck Roman, these being 2 of them. The others were Peaceholder, which is a 1500 vanilla, but it's a light psychic monster, Stop Defense, which changes a monster that's in defense to attack, which is a fine card. We could also see that coming to Duel Links a little bit early, I think, and Psychic Trap Hole, which when your opponent normal summons a level 5 or higher monster while you have 2 or more face-up psychic monsters, destroy that normal summoned monster. So, pretty good, and if that came to Duel Links right now, it would probably make Cyclics very strong. The next card we're going to look at is everyone's favourite, Nessus the Star Knight. So this card is pretty unassuming, just a 1500 vanilla, but this card was not released until Battle Deck Roa. So in the same way that we have the Strongest Battle deck Roman, this was Roa's battle deck, and he did have this 1500 vanilla. Again, it didn't like break the game. A 1500 vanilla at this point was nothing crazy, it's nice that it was included. Next up is the Dark Magician Girl. So we're already getting quite far through. Dark Magician Girl was released as a promo card between sets 9 and 10, right around the same time that the Strongest Battle decks came out. And again, Dark Magician Girl didn't really do anything. It took a very long time for Dark Magician to do much of anything in Rush, so the fact that we have the skill is a really big deal, and getting Dark Magician Girl this early also really does mix up quite a lot. Next up we have the Barrier. This is the card that I predicted was going to come to Duel Links quite early. Very, very good, and this card has become pretty much a staple. Against a lot of decks, it is very, very powerful, and being able to pop your opponent's monsters during your turn via a combat trick is very, very good. This came out in the 10th booster pack, Extra Transcend Enhancement pack. This pack was very good and very interesting because this is the set where fusion monsters were brought into the game. There's also, with it, brought 3 new types which are all exclusive to fusion monsters, that being Cyborg, High Dragon, and Magical Knight, all for the villain of the arc, that being the Cyborg player, and we also have the High Dragons for Luke, and the Magical Knights for yugioh. Finally, it was released alongside another card with a star in its name, because originally this card was the Star Barrier, it had like an image of a star on it, and that was the Power Up. So this is kind of a series of cards that all have V in the name, and the Power Up was another generic card that gave a monster a boost of 400 attack. The next card we're going to take a look at is the Flame Manipulator. Now this card is pretty terrible, but those of you who have played classic Yu-Gi-Oh will probably remember that this card is half of the Flame Swordsman, which is why it came out after fusions were released. This card again is pretty unassuming. It's a spellcaster, 900 attack, 1000 defense. Is not really all that impressive, and this card did actually come out as part of a battle pack, which is kind of like a tournament pack or a turbo pack or a star pack, however you want to think about those extra packs. Those little packs only have a couple of cards in them. This was one of those. Next up we have the Piercing Samurai. This card was released in the 11th Rush set, Chaotic Omega Rising. And this card came out and was kind of unassuming. This was basically just a nice way for warriors to get a bit of piercing, which is something that warriors had lacked up to this point. Warriors really had to rely on like the Pierce or Powerful Pierce cards and the Kime Ruler attacking directly, because they really lacked any good in-archetype piercing, any way to attack directly outside of Kime Ruler. They really lacked multi-attack and destruction of cards, so Piercing Samurai is definitely a godsend, and that's probably why it came to Duel Links so much earlier, to give warriors a bit more of a fighting chance, because if you lack a way to get to your opponent's life points, you are really in struggle street in Rush. So the next card we're going to take a look at is the Noodle Art of Roastery, and interestingly this was actually I think the 3rd Noodle Art released in Physical Rush, and it is the first one released in Duel Links. So very good card to try and get the kind of Noodle OTK going, which is very, very interesting. I think realistically this card was brought forward so that they didn't have to release a character with multiple Noodle skills, because Noodle Art of Roastery is a very powerful card in its own right. It also tries to facilitate the normal monster Pyro strategy, but Pyro does always play some normal monsters, and the normal monster support cards are relevant, even if they fall off a little bit, but they never completely become useless. So I think trying to push the normal monster theme early is still a good idea, because that is when it will be its strongest. Alongside the Noodle Art of Roastery came Flavor Inspector. Now Flavor Inspector was a very strange card for me to see when it was announced, and that is because Flavor Inspector is actually half of a fusion, and obviously a Pyro fusion. But it did come out in the 11th set along with Noodle Art of Roastery and Piercing Samurai, and 2 Pyro fusions. The first 2, those being Meat Spice and Miso Instant. Meat Spice specifically being a very, very strong card, and still seeing some fringe play to this day. It's not really a tournament level card, but it's definitely kind of played in tier 3 Pyro decks, maybe some rogue Pyro decks, and still can be quite strong for creating quite a nice advantage engine. Next up, Ghost Cyclone, and this is where things are getting a bit funky, because at this point we are in the 14th set of Rush Duel, and the 14th set is called Galaxy of Fate. And that's because that is the first set from Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush, so we're now officially out of the 7s era. So obviously after Yu-Gi-Oh! 7s came Yu-Gi-Oh! Go Rush, which was the follow-up anime, which will also be what we assume will be the next world in Duel Links, which won't be out for a long time. But it's very strange that we got cards as far ahead as the 14th set, the next generation effectively of the game, brought this far forward. And Ghost Cyclone is one of those cards. Now Ghost Cyclone, it's probably been talked to death, I've spoken about it as well. It's typically a going second card, you put it in the side deck. There are some decks like Sea Serpents that are able to make really good use of this card by emptying their graveyard over and over again, to try and basically make sure you always have an empty graveyard so you always get the draw, which makes this card very strong. Recently it also saw a lot of play in a deck called Solitaire in the physical game, which was a deck that basically would play just a crap ton of spells, cycle through your entire deck in one turn, summon out monsters that get stronger for every spell in your graveyard, and try and OTK your opponent. Because you're playing so few monsters in the deck, Ghost Cyclone's draw effect will almost always be live, and because you're playing so few monsters, you'll also rarely have monsters on the field. Very interesting this card came out so quickly, especially since most types do have back row hate, so it's interesting that this card came out so early instead of releasing all of those cards. But again, not all types have a back row hate, things like fish, things like dinosaurs, so it does make sense to release the generic ones first, so that those other decks don't feel like they have quite a big step down in power or a step down in quality of life. So the next card we're going to talk about is Paku-Paku-Chu. Again, from Galaxy of Fate. This card was actually part of the Meeg-chan support that came out. Meeg-chan, just being a 2500 vanilla beast monster, was probably the best target for Paku-Paku-Chu because you basically got to take a high attack monster from your graveyard and put it back in your hand. But with this card being released so early, the beast engine has become this very interesting thing that was just never a part of the physical game, because at this point we already had so many cards. We already had so many cards for fixing our hand, for draw power, for dealing with our opponent's board, for even just getting more monsters to our hand. So Paku-Paku-Chu was just kind of not really seen as very useful outside of playing beasts, and beasts have never been a strong deck ever in Rush history. Even to this day, they are very much struggling to make any kind of impact. So Paku-Paku-Chu being meta is really, really cool in my opinion. Next up, we have the Rice Terrace Secure. This card came out as a promo between sets 14 and 15. Very interesting that we got this one so early, but it's an interesting card. This came out around the time that we got the next wave of Aqua support, which is actually pretty good for Aquas, and we will be seeing one of those cards come out with the Mimi event coming out soon. But all in all, this card, when it came out, didn't do a ton. This card saw a little bit of play when it did come out, just because Aquas do lack a lot of the tools to be able to kind of do everything in engine, so having an Aqua monster that could effectively out cards and potentially change the battle positions of multiple monsters was actually pretty okay at the time. And next up, we have Nekogal number 2. So a tribute monster, 1900 attack, 2000 defense. Not great, realistically. Let's be honest, this card is not fantastic. The reason this card was okay when it came out was because it came out alongside the Heartless Hounds, and one of the Heartless Hounds' effect, I think it was Dorainu, has the ability to bring back a level 6 or lower normal monster from your graveyard. So this would be the perfect target for that. One of the other ones, Martial Hound Martial Shiva, could use its effect to bring back Dorainu, because it could just bring back a level 7 effect monster. Dorainu then brings back Nekogal, then if you have something like Beast Gear World out, you can then boost all of their attack by 300, giving you a 28, a 27, and a 22 on your board, which was really big at the time. Although the deck kind of lacked a lot of ways to get your opponent's life points, it was very good at building a very strong board, very similar to Worms. Next up, we have Flame Champion, and I suppose Flame Cerberus as well, because both of these cards were part of the Go Rush strongest battle decks for Manabu, who is the Pyro player of choice. He plays specifically a chemicalized deck, which is not really the noodle stuff, it's kind of its own thing, but still very cool nonetheless. And these cards came out so early, because this deck was released between sets 16 and 17, so already well into the Go Rush era. Next up, we have Seraph of Darkness, which was released during the 17th set of Rush, Fortissimo of Whirlwinds. This was actually released with the second archetype for fairies, the first one being the Sushi Fairies, the second one being the Dark Fairies, which are called Arts Angels. So this card came out so much early, which is why it is a Dark Fairy, because again, it is meant to be played alongside the other Dark Fairies. Then we have Return, which is a bit of a funny card. I don't actually think I've ever seen this card played. This came out in the Legend Awakening pack, which was the 20th set. Nothing really to say about this. It's not really seeing any play now. And then the final card, the most future card that's been brought out, the card from the furthest in the future, is actually Fire Yaru, which is a very strange one. This came out in a battle pack, which is again one of those weird little side sets. Nothing particularly interesting about this card. It's very funny that it got brought so far forward into Duel Links. And that is every single card that was released early in Duel Links. These cards are really cool, and they do get to interact in a lot of different ways because of the skills in Duel Links, and that is really the fun of Duel Links. Just being able to play the same game that I've already been playing in a fresh way. Now obviously there is the downside of having all this knowledge of the future means I know what the game can become, and I really want to play that at the same time, but I can go and do that, which is another part of the fun. But this was just a fun little video. Take a look at the cards that have come early, the cards that have come late, and hopefully have some ideas of what might come in the future. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.